What if I told you that in the year 1827, an entire village in the Scottish Highlands vanished overnight? Not abandoned, not destroyed by fire or flood, but simply, empty. As if every soul had walked into the mist and never returned. The only trace left behind was a man found 3 days later, wandering the nearby moors with no memory of his own name. Speaking in fragments of a language that scholars would later claim had never existed. But that's not the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is what he was searching for. Welcome back to another dive into history's darkest corners. I'm your host, and today we're exploring one of the most disturbing cases of collective amnesia ever recorded. A story that governments tried to bury, that historians refused to acknowledge, and that locals still whisper about in hushed tones nearly 2 centuries later. This is the story of Alan McBride, the man who claimed to be a god, and the price an entire village paid for believing him. Before we begin, I want you to understand something. What you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about memory, identity, and the very nature of divine power. The evidence I've gathered comes from church records, personal journals, and testimonies that were sealed for over 150 years. Some of you might dismiss this as folklore or mass hysteria. Others might find it too disturbing to believe. But by the end of this video, you'll understand why the Church of Scotland ordered every document related to the village of Gleendorka to be locked away, and why the land itself was declared cursed and uninhabitable. Our story begins in the winter of 1826, in the remote Highland village of Gleendorka, which translates to Dark Glen. The village was home to just over 200 souls, mostly sheep farmers and their families who had lived in these mountains for generations. They were devout Presbyterian folk, the kind who considered even smiling during Sunday service to be a form of blasphemy. Into this austere community arrived a man who would call himself Alan McBride, though, as we'll discover, even that name was a lie. According to the Journal of Margaret Sinclair, the village's midwife and one of the few literate residents, Alan first appeared during a particularly brutal snowstorm in December of 1826. She wrote, and I quote, "He came from the white, nothing like a shadow made flesh. His clothes untouched by frost, though he claimed to have walked for 7 days without shelter." When old Duncan asked his clan name, the stranger's face went blank, as a newborn's, and he wept tears that steamed in the cold air. What made Alan's arrival even more unsettling was his physical appearance. Multiple accounts describe him as unnaturally tall, nearly 7 feet in height, with pale skin that seemed to emit its own faint luminescence in darkness. His hair was white as fresh snow, despite his apparent age of no more than 30 years, and his eyes were described as being the color of deep water under ice. But it was his voice that truly unnerved the villagers. Margaret Sinclair wrote that when Alan spoke, his words seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, as if he were merely a vessel for another consciousness. Children would stop crying when he passed, and dogs would whimper and hide. For the first few weeks, Alan seemed like nothing more than an unfortunate wanderer who had lost his memory to the cold. The village minister, Reverend James Mackenzie, took him in, believing it was his Christian duty to help a lost soul. Alan helped with simple tasks around the village, never speaking unless spoken to, always with that same bewildered expression of someone trying to remember something just beyond reach. Then the dreams began. It started with the children. Little Moira Campbell, only 6 years old, woke screaming one night, claiming she had dreamed of standing in a vast hall made of clouds, where a giant with burning eyes sat on a throne of lightning. When her mother asked who the giant was, Moira pointed to Alan McBride's window and said, "Him, but he's forgotten how to be big." Within a week, every child in the village was having variations of the same dream. They spoke of temples that floated in the sky, of storms that obeyed Alan's commands, of him wearing robes woven from Aurora Borealis and commanding armies of beings made from pure light. Most disturbing of all, they claimed that in these dreams, Alan would look directly at them and ask, "Do you remember my name? Please, little ones, do you remember what I was called?" Reverend Mackenzie dismissed these as children's fantasies, influenced by ancient Celtic folklore. But then the adults began dreaming to. Margaret Sinclair's journal entries from this period make for genuinely disturbing reading. She described dreams where she stood on a mountain that reached beyond the stars, watching Alan create storms with gestures of his hands. In her dreams, he would turn to her with tears streaming down his face and beg her to remember his true name, saying that without it, he was slowly ceasing to exist. But the most chilling entry came from February 15, 1827. Margaret wrote, "I dreamed I was in the kirk, but it was wrong. The walls breathed like living flesh, and the windows showed not our village, but a realm of perpetual storm. Alan stood at the pulpit, but he was himself, and not himself. His skin crackled with lightning, and his voice shook the very foundations of reality. He said, 'I am the storm that walks, the tempest given form, the God of thunder who has forgotten his own nature. Help me remember, faithful ones, before the silence takes me completely.' I woke to find my pillow soaked with tears I did not remember shedding." By March, the entire village was in the grip of what could only be described as collective madness. People would stop in the middle of conversations, staring at Alan with expressions of desperate longing, as if trying to recall something vital they had lost. Children would follow him through the streets, not speaking, just watching with wide, frightened eyes. The weather began to reflect the village's deteriorating mental state. Storms that should have been impossible in the Scottish climate began to form overhead. Lightning struck with surgical precision, never harming anyone but creating elaborate patterns in the ground that hurt to look at directly. The local sheep began to die, not from disease or predation, but from what the village's only doctor described as profound terror made manifest in the flesh. It was around this time that Alan began to change as well. The confusion in his eyes was gradually being replaced by something that witnesses described as a terrible, dawning awareness. He would stand for hours staring at the storm clouds, his lips moving soundlessly, as if trying to recall an incantation. Just beyond his grasp, then came the night that changed everything. On March 21, 1827, during the spring equinox, Alan McBride walked to the center of the village square and began to scream. But this wasn't the scream of a man in pain. According to the few surviving accounts, it was the sound of reality itself being torn apart. Windows shattered throughout the village, and the very air seemed to ripple like water. When the screaming stopped, Alan's voice had changed completely. Gone was the uncertain, confused tone of a lost wanderer. In its place was something vast and ancient. Speaking in a language that predated human civilization, Margaret Sinclair managed to transcribe some of what he said, though she admitted that the words seemed to burn themselves into her mind rather than entering through her ears. "I remember now. I am Tyronoch, the Thunderwalker, the Stormfather, who ruled before your gods learned to speak, but something has taken my name from me, cast me into this small flesh, made me forget the sound of my own power." What happened next defies rational explanation. Every person in the village began to speak in unison, their voices joining Alan. In that impossible language, children, adults, even the bedridden elderly rose and walked to the square, all chanting words that hurt the mind to hear. The storm that formed above Glendorka that night was visible from Edinburgh. Over 100 miles away, travelers on distant roads reported seeing lightning that moved like living creatures, forming shapes that suggested vast wings and claws made of pure electrical fire. But here's where the story takes its most disturbing turn. The next morning, the village was empty. Not destroyed, not burned, not swept away by flood or avalanche, simply empty. Every house stood intact, meals still on tables, fires still burning in hearths, but not a single human soul remained. Except for one. 3 days later, a search party, sent from Inverness, found Alan McBride wandering the moors, once again confused and lost, with no memory of his own name or how he had come to be there. But now he was searching for something specific. He would approach every member of the search party with desperate eyes and ask the same question over and over. "Do you remember my name? Please, I know you must remember it. Without it, I am nothing." The search party brought Alan to Edinburgh, where he was examined by the finest physicians and alienists of the time. Their reports, classified until 1973, make for chilling reading. They described a man whose very existence seemed to be fading, becoming less substantial with each passing day. Photographs taken of him during this period showed a figure that becomes increasingly transparent, as if he were slowly ceasing to exist. But the most disturbing aspect of Alan's condition was his effect on others. Anyone who spent extended time in his presence began to experience the same dreams that had plagued the villagers of Gleendorka. They would see visions of a god of storms who had been stripped of his divine nature and cast into human form. As punishment for some unknowable transgression, Dr. Edmund Blackwood, the alienist assigned to Alan's case, wrote in his private notes, "The patient's condition appears to be one of ontological dissolution. He is quite literally forgetting how to exist. More troubling still, he seems to be spreading this condition to others through some form of metaphysical contagion. I have recommended immediate isolation, though I fear it may already be too late." Dr. Blackwood was right to be concerned. Within 2 weeks of beginning his examination of Alan, he too began to fade. His final journal entry, written in handwriting that becomes increasingly faint with each word, reads, "I understand now. He is not becoming nothing, he is becoming everything." The storm that took the village was not destruction, but transformation. They have joined him in whatever realm gods go to die, and I feel myself being drawn to follow. Dr. Blackwood was found dead in his study the following morning, though the cause of death was listed simply as cessation of being. His body showed no signs of injury or disease. He had simply stopped existing in any meaningful sense. Alan himself vanished from the Edinburgh Asylum on April 30th, 18. The guards reported that his cell was empty when they checked at dawn, though they swore he had been there only hours before. The only trace left behind was a message scratched into the stone wall in that same unknown language that had been heard in Gleendorka. When translated years later by linguists who subsequently suffered nervous breakdowns, it read, "I go to search for my name in the spaces between the storms." This is where the official story ends, but the truth is far more disturbing. Church records from the period, sealed for over a century and only recently declassified, reveal that similar incidents occurred throughout Scotland and northern England over the following months. Villagers would report a tall, pale stranger asking about forgotten names, followed by mass disappearances and storms of impossible intensity. The Church of Scotland launched a secret investigation, led by a group they called the Bearers of Silence. Their mission was to track down and contain what they referred to as the Wandering God before he could reclaim his full power. The few surviving reports from this investigation describe encounters with a being who appeared less human with each sighting, his form becoming increasingly translucent and wreathed in perpetual lightning. The last confirmed sighting of Alan McBride, or Taranach, or whatever he truly was, came in October of 1827. A fishing village in the Orkney Islands reported that a figure had walked out of the North Sea during a storm, water streaming from his clothes but never making him wet. He asked the same question he had been asking for months. "Do you remember my name?" When the villagers said no, he walked back into the sea and was swallowed by a waterspout that formed around him like a liquid tornado. The entire village population vanished that night, leaving behind only empty houses and the lingering smell of ozone. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying: it never really ended. Modern meteorologists have identified what they call the Highland Anomaly, a recurring pattern of impossible storms that form over the Scottish Highlands every few years. These storms move in ways that violate known atmospheric physics, often creating lightning patterns that form recognizable shapes when viewed from satellite imagery. More disturbing still are the reports that continue to surface. Even today, hikers in the Highlands occasionally report encounters with an impossibly tall figure who approaches them during storms, his face filled with desperate hope, asking if they remember a name he cannot speak. Those who have such encounters often develop temporary amnesia, forgetting not just the meeting, but sometimes their own identities for days or weeks afterward. The village of Glen Dorka remains uninhabitable to this day. The few attempts to resettle the area have failed, with new residents reporting dreams of vast storm gods and an overwhelming compulsion to walk out into the wilderness and never return. The Scottish government officially lists the land as unsuitable for habitation due to unstable geological conditions. But locals know better. They say that on nights when the storms are particularly fierce, you can still hear voices in the wind, calling out names in languages that predate human civilization. And if you listen very carefully, underneath it all, you can hear the sound of something vast and terrible weeping, searching for a word that would make it whole again. So what really happened in Glen Dorka? Was Alan McBride truly a forgotten god, cast into human form and stripped of his divine nature? Or was this simply the most elaborately documented case of mass hysteria in Scottish history? The evidence, such as it exists, points to something far more disturbing than simple madness. The linguistic analysis of the unknown language spoken during the events shows consistent grammatical structures and vocabulary that suggest it was not created by human minds. The storm patterns documented during the incidents violate several laws of atmospheric physics, and the continuing reports of encounters with the wandering god suggest that whatever began in 1827 is far from over. Perhaps most chilling of all is the possibility that Alan McBride is still out there, still searching for the name that was stolen from him, growing weaker and more desperate with each passing year. The church records speak of a being whose very existence depends on being remembered, whose power was tied not to worship but to recognition. What happens when a god forgets his own name? What happens when the storms themselves begin to fade because there is no one left to remember what they once meant? The answer, I fear, is that we may be about to find out. If you ever find yourself in the Scottish Highlands during a storm, and you encounter a tall, pale figure who asks if you remember his name, I have only one piece of advice: run. Don't look back, don't try to help, and whatever you do, don't try to remember. Because some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, and some names are too powerful to speak aloud. The god who forgot his own name is still searching, still hoping that someone, somewhere, remembers what he once was. And until that day comes, or until he finally fades into nothing, the storms will continue to rage, and villages will continue to empty under skies that crackle with the desperation of a deity slowly ceasing to exist. Thank you for watching. And remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved. If this story has disturbed you as much as it has me, please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've had any encounters with impossible storms or strangers asking about forgotten names, well, perhaps it's better if you keep those experiences to yourself. Until next time, stay curious, but stay safe. The world is full of shadows, and some of them remember when they used to be gods.